The gate creaked as Rita Collins finished her morning rounds. The fog sat low across the pasture, pale and silent, muffling every sound except the soft clatter of hooves. It was March 12, 1981, and Rita had been up before dawn, tending to a sick foal at a stable outside Fort Morgan, Colorado. The air was cold enough to sting her fingers as she locked the feed room and wiped her hands on her coat. The horses shifted uneasily, ears flicking toward the far end of the fence. Rita glanced up. Beyond the fog, she saw faint tire marks near her truck, fresh ones, not from her own vehicle. The gate to the access road was half open. She remembered closing it earlier, a small detail, but it made her pause. She stepped closer, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. The mist thickened as the wind picked up. She saw footprints, bigger than hers, leading away from the truck and looping back toward the gate. She hesitated, scanning the quiet field. Nothing moved. Rita was known for her calm nature. She had worked with animals long enough to trust her instincts, and they were telling her something was not right. She took one last look around before climbing into her truck. Inside, the keys rested on the seat where she had left them, and her thermos sat in the cup holder. She reached for it, felt the warmth, and sighed. She never started the engine. Hours later, a farmhand named Michael Reese arrived at the stables. He expected to find Rita finishing her rounds as she did every morning. Instead, her truck was parked crookedly near the gate, door slightly ajar, keys still inside. Her jacket was folded neatly on the passenger seat, and her coffee thermos had tipped, spilling across the mat. At first, he thought she had gone to check on the horses. But when he called her name across the field, only the animals answered, stamping nervously in their stalls. He checked the barns, the feed shed, the small office. No sign of her. Rita's medical bag was still open on the workbench, and the syringe she had used earlier that morning was still on the tray. By noon, worry had replaced confusion. Michael drove to a nearby farmhouse and called the sheriff's office. Within the hour, 2 deputies arrived. They examined the area around the truck, marking off a perimeter with stakes and rope. The ground was still damp from the previous night's frost, holding faint impressions of footprints, tire tracks, and something else, marks that suggested a struggle. One deputy crouched near the edge of the dirt road. "She dropped something here," he said quietly. It was a bracelet, broken at the clasp, one bead missing. Michael confirmed that it belonged to Rita. She wore it every day. The deputies radioed for additional units. The sheriff himself arrived shortly after. They began a methodical search across the fields, calling her name as they fanned out. The dogs picked up a faint trail leading toward the creek that bordered the property, but the scent disappeared at the waterline. By late afternoon, the fog had lifted, revealing the stillness of the land. Rita's truck remained untouched, like a photograph of a moment interrupted. Her lunchbox was still inside, unopened. Her handwriting filled the small notebook on the dashboard, routine notes about animal treatments, feed deliveries, and appointments. Nothing unusual. Investigators canvassed nearby farms and questioned workers who had seen her that morning. One farmer remembered a blue pickup passing along the back road just after sunrise. He did not recognize the driver. He thought little of it at the time. The sheriff's team photographed the scene, collected cigarette butts from the ground near the truck, and bagged the bracelet fragment for evidence. Every detail was logged, but the picture remained incomplete. It was as if Rita had vanished in the span of minutes between finishing her work and walking to her truck. Night fell quickly over the plains. Search teams continued under the glare of portable lights, their voices low, their movements steady. Deputies swept the barns again, checking haylofts and storage sheds. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no discarded clothing, no traces of blood. The only sound was the rustle of the wind through the empty stalls. At 9 p.m., the sheriff suspended the search until daylight. Rita's parents were notified. Her father arrived before dawn, standing quietly beside the truck, staring at the ground where his daughter's footprints faded into the mud. The next morning, the search resumed with volunteers from neighboring farms. They combed ditches, creek beds, and the nearby woodland. The sheriff called in state investigators, hoping for expertise beyond the local department's capacity. A helicopter sweep later that day revealed disturbed soil along a shallow creek 2 miles east of the stable. Deputies approached on foot, their boots sinking into the soft ground. There, half submerged in reeds and debris, they found a piece of torn fabric, pale blue, matching the color of Rita's uniform. The area was cordoned off immediately. Divers entered the creek to examine the waterlogged banks. Within minutes, they made a grim discovery. A body, partially buried beneath the silt and tangled branches, was pulled from the current. Identification would take hours, but the sheriff already knew. The bracelet fragment matched. The scene was silent except for the hum of generators and the quiet commands of investigators. Evidence was collected carefully. Fibers from the clothing, soil samples, a single cigarette butt found nearby. The coroner's vehicle arrived before sunrise. Rita Collins, 28 years old, had been found less than a day after she vanished. When the medical examiner examined her body, they noted bruises along her arms and neck, consistent with a violent struggle. Beneath her fingernails were traces of skin and a single fiber, dark in color, synthetic, not from her clothing. It was bagged and stored for testing. As dawn broke over the Colorado plains, the sheriff stood near the truck once more, his eyes tracing the marks on the ground. The footprints told part of the story, but not enough. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. One item found near the gate puzzled everyone, a man's cigarette lighter, engraved with initials that no one in Rita's circle recognized. And that was where the trail began. Rita Collins lived a life defined by quiet purpose. At 28, she worked as a veterinary assistant in Fort Morgan, Colorado, traveling between local farms to care for livestock. Her days began before sunrise and often ended long after dusk. Those who knew her said she never complained about the long hours or the unpredictable weather. Animals came first, always. She grew up on a small property just a few miles from where she disappeared. Her parents, Harold and Linda Collins, described her as calm, reserved, and endlessly patient. She preferred the company of horses and cattle to crowds and noise. Her job was not glamorous, but it mattered to her. Every foal she helped deliver, every sick animal she treated, became part of the rhythm that defined her life. Rita's small rental house sat on the edge of a dirt road surrounded by open fields. Inside, everything had its place: boots by the door, work jacket hanging by the kitchen chair, notebooks stacked neatly on the counter. Her life was simple, routine, and solitary. She had friends in the community, mostly farmers and veterinarians she assisted, but few close companions. Most evenings, she read veterinary journals or wrote notes for the next day's visits. Those who saw her daily said Rita never seemed restless or unhappy. She worked hard, saved money, and kept to herself. There were no signs of distress or conflict in the weeks before her death. She had no enemies, no debts, no reason to vanish. That was what confused investigators the most. Her co-workers remembered her last week at the clinic as ordinary. She had completed a series of field calls, including one at a ranch 20 miles west of town. She mentioned a minor disagreement with a client about an unpaid bill, but brushed it off as nothing worth worrying about. No one pressed her further. When detectives began building her background profile, they found a woman whose life left few footprints. No criminal record, no sudden lifestyle changes, no unusual financial activity. Her calendar was filled with notes about vaccinations, breeding schedules, and supply lists. The only irregular entry appeared 2 days before her disappearance. A late visit added after hours, with no name or address written beside it. Friends described her as someone who rarely asked for help. She changed her own tires, fixed her own fences, and drove the same pickup she had owned for nearly a decade. Independence was part of her identity. Even so, people noticed small hints of unease in the weeks before she vanished. She had started locking her truck more often, checking behind her before leaving a stable. A fellow assistant recalled one conversation that stood out. Rita mentioned she had been receiving calls from an unfamiliar number, always silent when she answered. She joked about it at the time, calling it a wrong number that never gives up. Investigators later confirmed that the calls came from a payphone on Highway 52. But the trail went cold after that. Her last known evening was spent at her parents' home for dinner. They remembered nothing unusual. She laughed, talked about a new treatment method for colic, and promised to stop by again over the weekend. When she left, her mother reminded her to drive carefully. Rita smiled, said she always did, and stepped into the night. After her death, neighbors came forward to speak about her kindness. She once stayed up all night tending to a farmer's injured horse without asking for payment. She helped children bottle feed orphaned lambs during spring festivals. People remembered her as steady and dependable, someone who gave far more than she ever asked for in return. Yet, beneath that calm surface, investigators began to sense a tension they could not name. Interviews with co-workers revealed a small but critical detail. Days before her disappearance, Rita had a heated argument at one of the farms she visited regularly. No one knew who it was with. The owner refused to name the man, only saying it was about something personal. The statement added a new layer to the case. The argument had taken place 3 days before she vanished, and according to one witness, the man had driven away in a blue pickup truck. The first investigators arrived before sunrise. The fields were still wrapped in a thin veil of mist, and the ground was stiff with frost. Rita Collins's truck sat alone by the gate, its headlights off, its driver's door half open. The keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat lay her folded jacket and a small lunchbox she never opened. A thermos had tipped onto the floor, its contents drying into a dark stain. Detectives from the Morgan County Sheriff's Office began their work in silence. The scene looked ordinary at first glance. No shattered glass, no signs of forced entry, no obvious weapon. But the details spoke of interruption. Tire tracks curved sharply in the dirt beside the truck, veering toward the main road before fading into the distance. Near the gate, 2 distinct sets of footprints overlapped, one belonging to Rita, the other larger, heavier, and deeper in the soil. A deputy marked off the area with orange tape, while another took photographs. A faint trail of scuffed earth suggested a struggle. Near the rear wheel, they found a broken bracelet, its clasp snapped cleanly apart. Beads from it were scattered across the ground. Michael Reese, the farmhand who discovered the truck, confirmed what everyone feared. Rita never took that bracelet off. The sheriff crouched beside the driver's door. "She never made it inside," he murmured. The interior of the truck was neat. Her medical bag was in the back seat, her notebook open on the dashboard, showing the start of a new entry she never finished. Officers combed the area inch by inch. A cigarette butt lay near the fence post, the paper still intact, as if dropped moments before a confrontation. Another was found a few feet away. Neither Rita nor anyone at the farm smoked. Both were sealed in evidence bags. When the sheriff examined the dirt near the tailgate, he noticed something else, an uneven line in the soil, as though something had been dragged several feet toward the field. It ended abruptly, dissolving into trampled grass. There were no clear impressions beyond that point. The fog had erased the rest. By noon, word had spread through the small community. Locals gathered quietly along the road, whispering and watching as investigators worked. Reporters were held back behind the line of patrol cars. Rita's parents arrived and stood together in silence, their faces pale, their hands clasped tightly. The search widened to the nearby fields, drainage ditches, and creek beds. Dozens of volunteers joined deputies, sweeping the land in grid patterns. Hours turned into days, and still there was no sign of her. Then, on the morning of the 3rd day, a rancher called the sheriff's office. He had spotted something unusual near the shallow creek 2 miles east of the stable, a piece of blue fabric caught on a branch. Deputies responded immediately. The creek ran low that season, its water sluggish and brown. Beneath the surface, caught in a tangle of reeds, they saw what the rancher had described, a scrap of fabric, then something pale beneath it. Divers entered the water, working slowly and methodically. Minutes later, one raised his hand, signaling the grim discovery. A body was lifted from the creek and laid on the bank, covered with a tarp. The sheriff did not speak. He only nodded to the coroner, who confirmed what everyone already suspected. It was Rita Collins. The area was sealed off once again, now a second crime scene. Evidence technicians collected soil samples, waterlogged fibers, and the torn piece of fabric. A single hair was recovered from beneath the collar of her uniform. Everything was logged carefully, placed into labeled bags, and sent for testing. The coroner's preliminary examination began that same afternoon. The body was transported to the county medical examiner's office, where forensic pathologist Dr. Helen Bowers led the autopsy. Her report, completed within 24 hours, was precise and clinical. Cause of death: strangulation. There were bruises along the neck, consistent with the pressure of human hands. Small abrasions marked both wrists and forearms, defensive wounds. She had fought back. There were no signs of sexual assault. No foreign substances in her system, but under her fingernails, technicians found traces of skin and a single dark fiber, synthetic in texture, clinging tightly to her nail bed. Dr. Bowers noted that it was not consistent with any fabric from Rita's clothing. It was preserved carefully for future comparison. Back at the farm, investigators continued to reconstruct the final moments of her life. They mapped the footprints, photographed the tire impressions, and compared the tread patterns to vehicles registered in the area. A list of local trucks was compiled, focusing on older models that could match the marks near the scene. The cigarette butts were sent to the state lab for analysis. Though in 1981, DNA testing did not yet exist, investigators could only note the brand, Lucky Strike, unfiltered, and hope it meant something later. The sheriff's department interviewed anyone who smoked that brand in the area, but no one stood out. By the end of the week, the farm had turned from a place of work into a symbol of fear. Horses stood restless in their stalls, the smell of disinfectant lingering after the forensic teams left. Workers returned reluctantly, their conversations quiet, their eyes drawn to the gate where the tape had once hung. Reporters called it a mystery with too few clues. The sheriff called it something worse, personal. Whoever had taken Rita had known her schedule, her routine, and the isolated routes she traveled each morning. The timing was deliberate. The investigation expanded to include every farm she had visited in the past month. Detectives interviewed co-workers, ranch owners, and delivery drivers. They searched her home for anything that might connect her to a potential suspect. Nothing unusual surfaced. No threatening letters, no signs of forced entry, no missing belongings. Still, that single fiber from beneath her nails became the centerpiece of their hopes. It was the only piece of evidence that seemed to lead beyond the familiar circle of her quiet life. Under the sterile light of the laboratory, the technician examined it again. A dark strand, synthetic, possibly from a jacket or upholstery. It did not match anything she owned. It did not match any sample collected from her home, her truck, or her workplace. It belonged to someone else, and whoever that person was had been close enough for Rita Collins to fight back. The investigation into Rita Collins's murder began with urgency and confusion. Detectives from the Morgan County Sheriff's Office worked around the clock, driven by community pressure and the haunting stillness of an unsolved crime. They had evidence but no clear direction: tire tracks, cigarette butts, a broken bracelet, and a single dark fiber. None of it told a complete story. Detective Alan Pierce led the inquiry. A veteran of small-town policing, he was methodical but old-fashioned, relying on instinct more than science. In 1981, forensic tools were limited. DNA profiling did not exist. Fiber analysis could only narrow results, not identify a person. So Pierce turned to what he knew best: interviews, intuition, and patterns. The first phase of questioning began with those closest to Rita's daily routine. Farm owners described her as punctual, polite, and reserved. She rarely lingered after work and never mentioned fear or problems. Co-workers repeated the same sentiment. Rita was quiet but dependable. No one could think of a reason why anyone would want to harm her. Detectives soon focused on two men from her professional circle. The first was Tom Bennett, a mechanic who often serviced Rita's truck. He was in his mid-30s, known locally for being friendly but outspoken. Bennett admitted he admired Rita, calling her a good woman in a rough business. He told investigators he last saw her a week before the disappearance, when she came in for an oil change. His tone was steady, but detectives noticed small inconsistencies. He claimed he had been at his shop all morning on the day of her death, but no one could confirm his whereabouts before 9:00 a.m. The second person of interest was Ray Dalton, a ranch hand who had been fired 2 months earlier after several complaints of inappropriate behavior toward female workers. Dalton had a temper and a history of drinking. When questioned, he appeared nervous, shifting constantly in his seat. He denied knowing Rita well, insisting they only crossed paths a few times at local farms. Detectives found that his old truck, a 1974 model, had recently been sold. The bill of sale was dated 2 weeks after Rita's murder. The coincidence did not go unnoticed. Both men were questioned extensively, their homes searched with consent. Nothing linking them directly to the crime was found. Bennett's tools were clean. Dalton's old property showed no signs of connection. Still, both remained under quiet surveillance. Meanwhile, technicians examined every trace from the crime scene. The fiber found beneath Rita's nails yielded no immediate match. It was determined to be from a dark synthetic blend used in common jackets and vehicle interiors of the era, too broad to narrow down. The cigarette butts produced no usable leads. They were Lucky Strike, unfiltered, a brand common among older men in the area. The footprint impressions near the gate were measured and catalogued, but lacked enough detail to identify a specific shoe. With every passing week, the investigation grew colder. Detectives found themselves repeating the same interviews, chasing rumors and fielding calls from residents convinced they knew who the killer was. One woman swore she saw a stranger at the feed store days before the disappearance. Another insisted the mechanic had been jealous of Rita's independence. None of the tips led anywhere. Community pressure intensified. Newspapers printed daily updates, questioning the sheriff's progress. Talk around town turned bitter. People began locking their doors earlier, keeping their children close. Fort Morgan was a quiet farming town unused to fear, and now fear was all it had. Detective Pierce requested assistance from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Agents arrived with better equipment but the same limitations. Their forensic team re-examined the physical evidence, photographing every detail again. They confirmed that the fiber could not be tied to any item belonging to Rita or her household. Beyond that, the case remained stagnant. Frustration seeped into every report. Each theory unraveled under scrutiny. Some officers believed the attack was spontaneous, a crime of opportunity by a passing stranger. Others argued it was personal, someone who knew her schedule, someone familiar with the isolated route she took each morning. Both theories had merit, and both left the investigators divided. As spring turned to summer, the files grew thicker, filled with interviews, statements, and dead ends. The sheriff called the team into a briefing, reminding them that every small detail mattered. He ordered them to recheck all vehicle sightings from the morning of March 12th, the day Rita vanished. That afternoon, a new statement came in from Eleanor Price, a farm owner who lived 3 miles from the stables. She recalled something she had never considered important. Around 6:30 that morning, while feeding her chickens, she saw a blue pickup truck speeding along the back road that led toward the Collins property. It was older, dented, with a missing hubcap on the right rear wheel. She remembered because the driver slowed briefly near her gate, as if unsure of direction, then accelerated toward the open fields. Detectives checked local records, searching for any blue pickup matching her description. They found several, including one previously owned by Ray Dalton, but that vehicle had already been sold and could not be traced. When they reviewed the official case log, a troubling detail emerged. That same sighting, the blue pickup near Rita's route, had been mentioned once before in the earliest reports, logged by a deputy on the first day of the investigation. But now, weeks later, that note was missing from the evidence file. The record of the vehicle had quietly disappeared. The murder of Rita Collins sent a tremor through Morgan County. In 1981, the quiet farming towns of rural Colorado rarely faced violent crime, and almost never one that felt this personal. Rita was not a stranger from the city or a passing visitor. She was one of their own. The news spread first by word of mouth, then by headline. Within days, everyone in Fort Morgan, Brush, and the nearby farming circles knew her name and the details of her disappearance. People spoke about her at feed stores, church gatherings, and over coffee at the diner. Some refused to believe that anyone local could be capable of such a crime. They blamed drifters, truckers passing through Highway 34, or hunters who might have crossed the wrong property line. Others whispered darker theories, that the killer was someone who knew her, someone still among them. Fear began to change the rhythm of the town. Women stopped traveling alone before dawn. Barn lights stayed on longer into the night. Farmers started locking gates that had never been closed before. What had once been a place of open fields and open trust now carried the quiet tension of suspicion. Rita's parents, Harold and Elaine Collins, kept to their modest home outside town. They gave no interviews and spoke little in public. Neighbors described them as composed but hollow-eyed. They attended every church service, sitting in the same pew, saying little. Elaine often left flowers at the stable where her daughter had last been seen. She stayed only minutes each time, never speaking, always leaving before anyone approached. The sheriff's office continued to issue careful updates, promising that the investigation remained active. Yet as weeks turned into months, the community's confidence began to erode. Theories multiplied. Each person seemed to have their own version of the truth. An argument overheard, a stranger seen, a sound in the fog that morning. The absence of answers only deepened the divide. Local newspapers printed columns of speculation, urging caution, but feeding curiosity. The editorials spoke of safety and loss, of the fragility of peace in a small town. Headlines carried the same haunting question: who killed Rita Collins? Farmers organized volunteer patrols, hoping to spot unfamiliar vehicles. Residents started keeping logs of passing cars, convinced that somewhere in those notes lay the key to the mystery. But nothing came of it. Every lead faded into silence. Every rumor ended without proof. By the end of summer, the official search had slowed. Detectives moved to other assignments. The evidence sat sealed in boxes, stored in the basement of the sheriff's office. Fiber samples, photographs, and reports yellowing with time. The case, unsolved and heavy with doubt, drifted toward the edges of memory. But one person refused to let it fade. Detective Alan Pierce, the man who had first walked the scene by the fogged pasture, still carried the file on his desk. Each night, long after the office lights went dark, he stayed behind, flipping through the pages, reading the same notes again and again. Months had passed. Leads had vanished, yet Pierce could not accept that this was the end. Something about the evidence still felt wrong. Something missing. Something hidden in plain sight. And before the year was over, his persistence would uncover the first real break in the case and detective-er. Alan Pierce began the summer of 1982 with a list of names and hopes that something, anything, might connect one of them to Rita Collins. He started with the mechanic, a man who had serviced Rita's truck several times in the months before her death. Locals described him as talkative, sometimes overly friendly. His name had come up repeatedly during interviews, his behavior often interpreted as odd, but not violent. When detectives questioned him, he seemed calm, perhaps too calm. He explained that on the morning Rita vanished, he had been repairing a combine engine at a neighboring farm. Several workers confirmed it. His time cards matched. The alibi held. The next suspect was less steady. A ranch hand, recently dismissed from a nearby property, had been known to follow Rita around, making remarks she often ignored. After her disappearance, he was nowhere to be found. It took weeks for officers to trace him across state lines, eventually locating him in Oklahoma. He denied any involvement, stating he left Colorado days before Rita vanished. His story matched gas receipts and employer statements. Though investigators remained uneasy, they had nothing solid. The lead dissolved like so many others. Back at the sheriff's office, the small evidence box sat under lock and key. The fiber found beneath Rita's fingernails was sent to a state crime lab, one of the few pieces of physical evidence that might tell a story. But in 1981, forensic testing had limits. The fiber was catalogued as synthetic, blue-gray, possibly from a carpet or upholstery. That was all. No brand, no match, no progress. Weeks turned into months, and the momentum began to slow. Pierce and his team worked the case between newer calls, burglaries, traffic accidents, domestic disturbances. Each time he passed the box on the shelf, he felt a quiet pull to open it again. But each time he did, it told him nothing new. The official reports thickened, filled with pages of interviews that went nowhere. Witness memories blurred, people moved away, and those who stayed grew tired of the questions. Every conversation ended with the same uncertainty. Someone must have done this, but no one knew who. By late 1983, the investigation reached a silent standstill. Rita's name was still spoken at church and remembered by her parents, but the urgency had faded. Detectives from the original task force were reassigned. Alan Pierce stayed on the case longer than most, filing follow-up requests, checking regional arrest records, and even writing to other jurisdictions about similar crimes. Nothing came back. The passing years did what time always does to evidence. It dulled it. Files yellowed. Photographs faded. The once vivid details of the crime scene, muddy tire tracks, spilled coffee, a folded jacket, became images on paper instead of memories. The bracelet found near the truck was returned to storage, tagged and forgotten. The fiber sample, sealed in an envelope, sat in a drawer that few ever opened. When Pierce retired in 1989, he took a copy of the case summary home with him, folded neatly inside his briefcase. He kept it in his desk, the name Rita Collins underlined twice in blue pen. He had told his wife once, years later, that it was the one case that never let him rest. Through the 1990s, the file gathered dust in the archives of the Morgan County Sheriff's Office. A few deputies newly hired might have seen the name once or twice when organizing old boxes. To them, it was another cold case from another time, unsolved, unremarkable, just part of the stack. Outside, the world changed. Technology advanced. DNA testing appeared in headlines. But inside the small evidence room, nothing moved. The air was dry, the lights dim, and the files of the unsolved waited in quiet rows. Then, in the autumn of 1997, a new detective named Laura Whitman began organizing cold files as part of a departmental review. She pulled down a faded box marked Collins, G, 1981. The handwriting on the label was Pierce's. Inside were the usual documents, photographs, witness statements, the lab report. But as she compared the crime scene inventory to the final summary, she noticed something odd. One line in the initial report listed an evidence item that was missing from the later documentation. A single object never logged again after the first day at the scene. It was small, easily overlooked, but it should have been there. And that simple inconsistency, buried in a box untouched for 16 years, was about to reopen the case that everyone had long forgotten. By the end of the 1980s, the name Rita Collins had begun to fade from the headlines. Her photograph, once taped to the bulletin board of the Morgan County Sheriff's Office, had curled at the edges. The ink on the missing person poster had turned from black to brown. The case that once consumed an entire department was now another file number in a growing cabinet of unresolved crimes. Her parents never stopped remembering. Every March, on the week she disappeared, they drove to the edge of the old pasture and left a wreath tied to the fence post. They never stayed long. Over time, fewer people joined them. Friends moved away. The pastor who had performed Rita's funeral retired. The Collins family learned to grieve in silence, marking each year not by progress, but by endurance. The farmland where Rita once worked changed hands twice. The horse stable where she had made her last rounds closed in 1993 after the owner passed away. By the early 2000s, weeds had overtaken the pens, and the barn roof sagged in the middle. New owners used the land for hay and grain. To most who drove past, it was simply another piece of old property on the Colorado plains. Few remembered that it had once been a crime scene. Inside the sheriff's office, a newer generation of deputies filled the desks once occupied by Pierce and his colleagues. The cold case files were moved to the lower shelves of the evidence room, then to metal cabinets in the basement. The temperature there was uneven. Too dry in summer, too cold in winter. Cardboard boxes warped, tape lost its grip, and the smell of dust hung heavy in the air. Occasionally, a new detective would stumble upon Rita's file. A name would catch. Their eye, or a small-town anniversary piece in the paper, would bring her case back into brief conversation. Someone might review the notes, send a request to the state lab, or call one of the surviving witnesses. But the answers were always the same. No new evidence, no new technology, no match. Each time the box was resealed and returned to its place. In the 1990s, DNA testing entered forensic science, but only a few major cases in larger cities saw its use. The samples from Rita's case, blood scrapings, a few hairs, and the fiber under her fingernails, remained sealed in their original envelopes. The sheriff's office lacked the funding and resources to test old evidence. The fiber, the one piece that never quite fit the rest, sat in storage, its paper label yellowed and nearly illegible. Through the decades, time continued to erase what memory had left. The witnesses grew older. Some died. Others moved far away, their recollections softened by years. By the 2000s, a generation had grown up in Morgan County who had never heard of Rita Collins. The town's newer residents drove past the old pasture daily, unaware of its history. The murder had become something half-remembered, a story told quietly among those old enough to recall it. In 2008, when the sheriff's office digitized old case files, Rita's record was scanned and archived. Her photograph, once a living face, on a wall, was reduced to a low-resolution image in a computer folder labeled Cold Cases, Unsolved. It was efficient, but impersonal. The digital file did not hold the weight of her story. The chill of the fog that morning, the silence of the stable, or the years of unanswered questions. Still, a few who remembered her kept the story alive. A retired deputy mentioned her case during a local radio interview in 2015, calling it the one that should have been solved. His words briefly reignited local discussion. For a few weeks, old clippings resurfaced, but as quickly as it returned, the interest faded again. The evidence remained sealed, untouched, and silent. Time had buried what the investigation could not, yet history has a way of circling back. In 2021, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation launched a statewide initiative to clear the backlog of untested forensic samples from unsolved crimes. Hundreds of boxes, some untouched for decades, were pulled from storage rooms across the state and shipped to a new DNA testing facility in Denver. Among them was one small weathered evidence box from Morgan County, marked in fading ink, Collins R. 1981. And with that single shipment, after 40 years of silence, the case of Rita Collins was quietly reopened. The evidence box arrived at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in early spring 2021, its edges worn and its label nearly unreadable. Inside were small envelopes marked fiber sample, nail scrapings, and biological residue. The paperwork still carried the faded signature of Detective Alan Pierce, dated April 1981. For the first time in 40 years, the evidence that had once defined an entire community's tragedy was about to be tested with technology that had not existed when Rita Collins was killed. Forensic technician Maria Delgado was assigned to process the sample. She had handled dozens of cold cases in recent months, part of the state's new initiative to clear decades of backlog. But there was something about the name Rita Collins that stood out, perhaps the age of the case, or the stark simplicity of the evidence log. Only a few items had survived intact, and the fiber found under Rita's nails was one of them. Under magnification, the fiber revealed a pattern of blue-gray synthetic weave, the kind used in certain vehicle interiors during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Delgado extracted a trace residue from the material, then prepared it for DNA testing using the latest low-copy number techniques. Even after decades, the results stunned the lab. There were still traces of male DNA present, embedded deep in the fiber. The first run yielded only a partial genetic profile. It was incomplete, degraded, but viable enough to be analyzed. The data was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, but no match appeared. Still, the lab did not close the file. With advancements in forensic genealogy, even an incomplete profile could now serve as a starting point. Weeks later, after uploading the sequence to a national genealogical database, a breakthrough came. A partial familial match appeared, a distant cousin from Texas, whose family tree had been voluntarily uploaded for ancestry research. Using genetic triangulation, analysts built a network of related individuals across several states, narrowing down generations of relatives until one line pointed to a name that had never appeared in the original investigation. Charles Chuck Myers, age 64, former ranch worker. Once employed across multiple properties in northern Colorado and western Nebraska. Now retired and living quietly outside Tucson, Arizona. His record showed no arrests, no violent offenses, nothing that connected him to a crime. But the genealogical link was too specific to ignore. Further testing began, this time using court-approved collection from discarded DNA, an item recovered from his trash during surveillance. When the results returned, the match was undeniable. The sample from the fiber beneath Rita Collins's fingernails matched Charles Myers' DNA profile with absolute certainty. Investigators moved swiftly. The Morgan County Sheriff's Office, in collaboration with Arizona authorities, reopened the file officially. Detective Laura Whitman, the same investigator who had rediscovered the missing evidence entry back in 1997, now led the renewed inquiry. The original documents she had studied decades earlier were suddenly relevant again. Every note, every photograph, every fragment of the crime scene report held new weight. She pored over the details with a kind of reverence, knowing that this was the moment Alan Pierce had always hoped would come. The spilled thermos, the unlocked truck, the folded jacket, all of it returned to the forefront of the story. But now, finally, there was a name connected to the evidence that had haunted them for decades. The team began reconstructing Myers' history. He had been born in 1957, raised in a working-class family in eastern Colorado. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, he had drifted between ranches and stables, taking temporary work during calving and harvest seasons. Pay was steady, cash-based, and he often moved without notice. Employment records were incomplete, but one document stood out. A short-term contract from early 1981 at a farm located only a few miles from where Rita Collins made her daily veterinary rounds. That detail sent a jolt through the team. It explained how he might have crossed paths with her and how he could have known her routines. Whitman contacted surviving witnesses, including the retired farm owner's son, now in his 70s. When shown a photograph of Myers from the early 1980s, he paused, then nodded slowly. He remembered a quiet man, hard-working, who kept to himself, but often lingered around the barns longer than others. He was there only a few months, the man recalled. Then one day he just stopped showing up. The discovery reframed everything about the original investigation. Back then, without DNA or databases, Myers had been invisible, just another transient worker passing through Colorado. No record, no address, no trace. The fiber from his truck upholstery had been the only link, but no one could have known that at the time. Now, 40 years later, the science had caught up with the truth. The blue-gray fiber matched the interior fabric used in 1978 Dodge pickup trucks, a detail confirmed through manufacturer archives. And when investigators searched Myers' historical vehicle registration, they found that he had owned one at the time of Rita's murder. In April 2021, detectives presented their findings to the district attorney's office. The evidence, though aged, was overwhelming. The DNA match, the vehicle link, the employment record, and the timeline of proximity. A warrant was issued for Charles Myers' arrest. Before the team moved in, Whitman reviewed the case file one last time. It was late in the evening. The office was silent, except for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. She looked down at Rita's faded photograph, 28 years old, smiling slightly, unaware that her face would one day become a symbol of endurance. Technology had done what persistence alone could not. The evidence that once seemed fragile and forgotten had spoken louder than anyone expected. The past, preserved in a single thread of fabric, had finally given up its secret. But as the team prepared to travel to Arizona to question Myers, one detail still unsettled Whitman. The employment record showed that he had worked at a farm only briefly, for less than a season. When she cross-referenced Rita's schedule, she noticed a familiar pattern: her weekly visits to that same property. Tending to livestock during calving season, Rita and Myers had crossed paths not by accident, but by routine. He had been there within reach, months before she died. And that realization, that the man responsible had been standing in plain sight all along, was only the beginning of what the detectives were about to uncover. Detective Laura Jennings had worked cold cases for nearly 15 years, but few had affected her the way the Rita Collins file did. When the DNA match to Charles Chuck Myers was confirmed, she should have felt relief. the kind that comes from a case finally gaining shape after decades of silence. Instead, she felt the weight of unfinished truth pressing harder than ever. Her first step was verification. Jennings knew that in a case this old, one wrong assumption could unravel everything. She began by retracing the timeline from 1981, studying every witness statement, every police note, every gap in the record. She noticed the handwriting differences between detectives, the changes in ink tone where pages had been replaced. The history of the investigation lay before her like layers of sediment, years of effort buried under years of neglect. She traveled to Fort Morgan, driving past the old pastures where the stable once stood. The barn was gone, replaced by weathered fencing and dry grass. But the silence of the land still felt heavy, as if the ground itself remembered. Jennings met with the few surviving witnesses who had been interviewed in the original investigation. Many were elderly now, their voices thin, their memories fragile. But small details began to surface. A former farmhand recalled a man with a blue pickup who often lingered near the stables. Another remembered seeing that same truck parked near the service road on the morning Rita vanished. Both descriptions matched the make and color of Myers's vehicle at the time. Jennings then focused on documentation. She searched county archives, payroll ledgers, and tax records from the early 1980s. Her persistence finally paid off when she located a worn payroll book from a property once owned by the Watson family, one of the farms Rita had visited frequently. On one of the faded lines, written in pencil, was the name Charles Myers. The date, February 1981. It placed him at the farm only weeks before Rita's disappearance. Piece by piece, Jennings built the bridge between the old evidence and the new. Myers's DNA was the core, but everything else began to tighten around it. The vehicle, the proximity, the absence of an alibi. She traced his movements through state employment records and discovered that he had left Colorado abruptly that same year, taking work in Wyoming before eventually settling in Arizona. No explanation was ever recorded. No farewell notice, no forwarding address. He had simply vanished. Still, Jennings wanted more than paper trails. She wanted human confirmation. Something tangible that could close the loop between evidence and behavior. She tracked down one of Myers's old friends, a retired mechanic named Daniel Hart, who had worked alongside him during the early 1980s. When asked about that period, Hart hesitated. He said that after hearing about the murder back then, Myers had seemed nervous, withdrawn. When pressed, Hart remembered something else. He had scratches, Hart said slowly, on his arms, deep ones. He told me he got them fixing a fence, but I remember thinking they looked more like claw marks. Jennings wrote the statement down, her pulse quickening. The detail matched the autopsy report. Defensive wounds on Rita's hands and forearms. It was the first physical connection between the victim's injuries and the suspect's own body. As she compiled her findings, Jennings built a timeline so precise it felt like reliving the case in real time. Rita's last morning. The fog, the open gate, the tracks leading away, and now, the man who had quietly disappeared into the next state with a secret he had never spoken aloud. By early 2022, she had enough to pursue an arrest warrant. The district attorney reviewed the documentation, the verified DNA match, the historical vehicle registration, the payroll entry, and the corroborated witness statements. It was the strongest chain of evidence the case had ever seen. The kind that could finally bring justice to a family that had waited 40 years. But as Jennings prepared to move forward, an unexpected development caught her attention. One morning, a colleague forwarded her a television clip from a local news station in Tucson, Arizona. The footage showed a gray-haired man sitting on a porch, sunlight cutting across his weathered face. The caption read, "Charles Chuck Myers speaks on cold case allegations." Jennings turned up the volume. Myers spoke calmly, his voice steady but defensive. "I never even knew Rita Collins," he said. "I never worked where they say I did. I heard about that case like everyone else years ago. They must have mixed something up." His expression was composed, almost indifferent, but his eyes flickered once. A brief shadow, barely visible. Jennings leaned closer to the screen. For the first time, she was not just chasing evidence. She was staring into the face of the man whose DNA had lived under a victim's fingernails for 40 years, and now he was denying ever knowing her. The investigation had turned public, and with his denial, the case was about to explode beyond the quiet walls of the cold case unit. Charles Chuck Myers had spent the last 4 decades blending into the quiet corners of rural America. On paper, he was unremarkable. A retired ranch hand, unmarried, without children, and living in a small house outside Tucson, Arizona. To his neighbors, he was the kind of man who kept to himself. He mowed his lawn twice a week, fixed his own fences, and waved politely but rarely spoke. Those who knew him used the same words: quiet, strange, private. Some thought he was harmless, an aging loner who simply preferred silence. Others admitted that he sometimes lost his temper over small things: barking dogs, loud radios, kids cutting through his yard. No one ever thought of him as dangerous, not anymore. But when detectives began to dig deeper, a different picture began to form. His work history, when traced across decades, showed a trail of short-term jobs on ranches, feedlots, and construction sites throughout the western states. Few employers kept him long. The reasons were rarely written, but when they were, the pattern was unmistakable: argumentative, unreliable, volatile temper. Detective Laura Jennings requested his old employment files from Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska. Some were barely legible, copied from brittle paper records. In one, dated March 1981, the owner of a livestock company had scribbled a brief note: Myers dismissed after incident with female worker. Verbal confrontation. There was no further explanation, no follow-up report, no name attached to the complaint. But the timing was precise, just days before Rita Collins disappeared. Jennings and her team widened their search. They found 2 other references to harassment during Myers' years of ranch work. One was from 1978, when a co-worker accused him of following her home from the barn after dark. Another was from 1984, after he had already left Colorado, when a woman in Wyoming reported that a ranch hand fitting his description had made her feel unsafe. In both cases, the allegations were dismissed as misunderstandings. No charges were ever filed. As investigators reconstructed his timeline, it became clear that Myers had left Colorado almost immediately after Rita's murder. His vehicle, a blue 1978 Dodge pickup, was sold within weeks. He took work in Wyoming, then in Idaho, and eventually settled in Arizona, where he lived under the radar. There were no marriages, no close friendships, and no social ties that lasted more than a season. He drifted, just as he always had. Neighbors in Arizona described him as distant but courteous. He kept his property tidy, repaired fences for nearby ranchers, and sometimes volunteered at a local feed store. To them, he was simply Chuck from down the road, but a few remembered small, unsettling moments. How his mood could shift without warning, how his eyes hardened when questioned, and how he avoided certain topics altogether. When Jennings reviewed the details with forensic psychologists, they called it controlled volatility, the kind of personality that remains calm until pushed, then reacts suddenly, without hesitation. It was the same type of temper that might explain the injuries found on Rita's body, the struggle near her truck, and the defensive wounds on her hands. Still, Jennings stayed cautious. Decades of investigation had taught her that assumptions could cloud the truth. She needed his reaction, the real one, when confronted with evidence that no man could explain away. In late 2022, detectives traveled to Arizona with a warrant for questioning. Myers met them at his front porch, his expression unreadable. He invited them inside, sitting stiffly in a wooden chair as they laid the evidence before him. The fiber, the DNA report, the payroll records, and photographs from 1981. Jennings spoke evenly, explaining that the DNA found under Rita Collins's fingernails matched his profile beyond any scientific doubt. She waited for him to respond, watching his hands, his eyes, the slow rhythm of his breathing. For a long moment, Myers said nothing. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. His face did not show surprise, only fatigue, as if he had expected this moment to come someday, but never truly believed it would. Finally, he looked at Jennings. his voice calm but heavy. "How did you find me after all this time?" It was not a denial. It was not confusion. It was recognition, the quiet acknowledgement of a man who knew the past had finally caught up with him. And with that single question, the weight of 40 years shifted. The truth, long buried under silence and dust, was about to surface. Charles "Chuck" Myers was brought back to Colorado in early spring, 42 years after Rita Collins's death. The extradition order came quietly, but the sight of the aging man in handcuffs still carried the weight of history. For the detectives who had reopened the file, it felt surreal. The ghost of a forgotten case now sitting under fluorescent lights in an interview room at the Morgan County Sheriff's Office. At first, Myers said little. He asked about the evidence, about the DNA, about how they had managed to find a match so many years later. Detectives explained each step: the fiber, the sample, the genealogical tracing. He listened carefully, eyes fixed on the table, his fingers tapping lightly against the metal surface. When asked about Rita Collins, he paused, then shook his head. "I knew of her," he said slowly. "She worked around the farms. Everyone did back then." Hours passed. Investigators alternated between silence and quiet questioning. They showed him photographs of Rita, her truck, her folded jacket, the open gate near the stable. Each image pressed against his calm exterior like waves wearing down a stone. Finally, he exhaled and whispered almost to himself, "I did not mean for it to happen." That was the first crack. He began to speak in fragments, short, halting sentences filled with regret but little detail. He said there had been an argument, something about a repair bill or a broken piece of equipment. Rita, he claimed, was upset with how he spoke to her. He followed her toward her truck, and the argument escalated. She turned away, he said. I grabbed her arm. She pulled back. I panicked. The words came out flat, mechanical, as if rehearsed through years of private torment. He claimed he had not planned to hurt her, that it was not supposed to happen. But every sentence fit the pattern the investigators already knew. The struggle by the truck, the defensive wounds, the signs of strangulation. When they asked what he did next, his voice broke for the first time. He said he froze. Then he dragged her toward the creek, leaving her there before driving off. He remembered the sound of water, the fog, the weight of silence afterward. Then nothing, only fear, and the decision to leave Colorado the next morning. His confession was incomplete, shaped by time and guilt. But it matched the forensic record in key details only the killer could have known. The torn bracelet, the spilled thermos, the direction of the tire tracks. Detectives verified his account against the original case files. It aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. Prosecutors called it a statement of truth, not just a confession. It filled the gaps that decades of investigation had failed to close. The impulsive act, the concealment, the sudden departure, every thread tied back to that morning in March 1981, when Rita Collins vanished from her routine without a trace. When the official arrest was announced, the courtroom filled with quiet faces. Journalists from Denver and Fort Morgan reported on the strange, almost cinematic nature of the case, a murder solved after 4 decades through DNA and persistence. The story reignited old pain across the community. For Rita's surviving family, it was not triumph. It was a reopening of wounds they had long learned to live with. Her parents were gone, but her younger brother, now in his 60s, attended every hearing. He said little to reporters, only that he had waited his whole life to hear someone say what happened to his sister. In Morgan County, the news spread quickly. People who had been children in 1981 now spoke of Rita as if she had disappeared only yesterday. Her name returned to conversations in cafes, feed stores, and church halls. Old newspaper clippings were pulled from drawers, and residents recalled the foggy morning that had haunted their town for decades. The case that had once faded into silence now echoed across generations. A reminder that time could bury evidence but never erase truth. And as cameras surrounded the courthouse steps, the question lingered in every voice, every whisper, every headline. How many others like Rita had been forgotten, waiting for justice that finally, after so long, had come home? The courtroom was silent as the judge entered. the air thick with decades of unfinished grief. Rita Collins's family sat together in the front row, faces drawn but steady. Her younger brother held a small photo of her, the same one once printed on missing posters across Morgan County in 1981. After so many years, justice had not come with fanfare, only with quiet, heavy breaths and the sound of papers being shuffled on a wooden bench. Charles Chuck Myers stood motionless at the defense table. Age had taken most of his strength, but not the shadow that followed him. When the charges were read, second-degree murder, obstruction, and unlawful disposal of a body, he showed no reaction. His bond was denied. The court ruled that the evidence, both old and newly uncovered, left no room for doubt. The DNA, the confession, and the reconstructed timeline painted a complete picture of guilt. Reporters filled the back rows, their notes crisp, their headlines already forming. Local newspapers called it Colorado's 40-year mystery solved. For the people of Fort Morgan, it was more than a headline. It was the closing of a story that had lived in whispers and rumors for too long. Outside the courthouse, the wind carried dust through the parking lot, lifting fallen leaves and swirling them into the cold air. Some who had grown up hearing about the case came to watch from a distance, uncertain whether to feel relief or sorrow. They spoke softly about Rita, how she loved animals, how she had once cared for their horses or patched a farm dog's wound. After decades of silence, her name returned to the town's memory. At the sentencing, the prosecutor read a brief statement from Rita's family. It spoke of gratitude, of patience, and of the pain that had never truly faded. There were no tears, only stillness. Her brother later said that justice, even after so long, felt less like victory and more like peace. "We just wanted her story to be known," he told the reporter. "We wanted people to remember she was real." The old stable where Rita had worked no longer existed. It had been torn down years earlier, the land sold and converted to open pasture. Only a faint outline of the fence remained, barely visible in the soil. For those who remembered, the emptiness of that field carried its own kind of memorial. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom did not erupt. There was no applause, no outburst, only silence, as though everyone inside understood that true justice in cases like this came not with noise, but with acknowledgement. Outside, a storm gathered across the plains. As the reporter dictated her final line, she paused. The wind had risen suddenly, curling around the courthouse doors. It sounded, she wrote later, exactly like the day Rita Collins disappeared. For 40 years, Rita Collins's name drifted through silence, a photograph in a drawer, a file in a cabinet, a memory fading into the wind over rural Colorado. But the truth, though buried by time, never disappeared. It waited patiently in sealed envelopes, in tiny fibers, in evidence bags stored beneath dust and fading labels. Justice did not arrive with sirens or bright lights. It came quietly through the hum of lab machines and the persistence of detectives who refused to forget. A single strand of DNA bridged the distance between 1981 and the present, proving that even in the slow turning of decades, truth does not die. It only waits to be found. In Fort Morgan, the farmland has changed, but the memory remains. The people who once whispered about Rita's disappearance now speak her name openly. Her story, long locked behind police reports and unanswered questions, has become part of the town's history, a reminder of how fragile safety can be and how long justice can take. Detective Laura Jennings still keeps Rita's photograph pinned above her desk. Not as a trophy, but as a promise that every case deserves to be finished. No matter how cold, no matter how distant. The story of Rita Collins is not one of vengeance, but of endurance, of the quiet strength of a community, of evidence that refused to fade, and of a truth that rose slow and steady from the silence of forgotten years, somewhere in another file, another drawer, another small-town archive. Another name waits, and perhaps one day, as it did for Rita, time itself will open that file and let it breathe again.